say thank you, welcome, and thank you for coming to this inaugural Klezmer Archive Coffee Hour session. We're going to use these sessions as a way to talk about various topics that have to do with the Klezmer Archive project and to share some of the results of the work that we've been doing and to get feedback from you as members of this community or invested in this project to help us remember things that we might otherwise forget or look over, or that identify items and ideas that need to be further refined as we move forward with this project. So this session is going to be about sort of archiving music of oral tradition, broadly speaking, and this is a reprise of a presentation that Clara and I prepared for the Music Librarians Association conference last year in March. And we've learned some more things since we made that presentation. And so I've added a few more concepts and ideas. But sort of generally speaking, we're going to be talking about the ways in which our proposed ontology tool, our proposed tool, and the ontology that we're using to describe the music that we're describing is going beyond existing resources and sort of adapting and adding ideas that are relevant to two major questions that we have about music of oral tradition, which is one, how to document music that is transmitted orally, and how to document the human relationships that are critical to the transmission of oral culture. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to just go through some slides that we had prepared for this presentation. But I'm going to add the caveat to all of you in this room that this is not simply to be a presentation. The idea for us here is to have a conversation. And so since I am sharing my screen, I'm going to encourage you to, if you have a question or a comment or want amplification or clarification, to just go ahead and in Klezmer Institute fashion, jump in whatever way that means to you. You can raise your hand, you can put something in the chat and Clara will monitor the chat. Or you could also, if it happens to be that I stop speaking for a hot minute, you can also just jump in with your question. So first, a little bit of a background on our Klezmer Archive project. We are embarked on a many-year journey to create a universally accessible, useful tool for interaction, discovery, and research on all available information about klezmer music and its related things, eventually Ashkenazic dance, Yiddish song, etc. But first of all, we're starting with music. This should be a resource for Jewish music studies, corpus studies, computational musicology, and etc. One of the things that, and we also take as a core value that this tool should be a way to facilitate engagement, not only for researchers, it's not only a resource for researchers and academics and scholars, but that this is a tool that's extremely useful and relevant to practitioners of klezmer music and Ashkenazic expressive culture, broadly speaking. And lastly, this is a space where we can also be kind of documenting the modes of transmission between heritage practitioners and cultural families, and as well as welcoming newcomers into our community. We were very grateful to receive a National Endowment for the Humanities grant from 2021 to 2022. So this is not news to any of you in this room, but what is music of oral tradition? And we have these two lovely quotes, one from Bronya Sakina, that talks about, what is this material that we're talking about? And then early on in our research, we discovered a young researcher from Budapest, Hungary, Emisha Iliafalvi, who had done a very big survey of existing digital humanities tools and who just realized that as she says here, the descriptive metadata templates describing physical objects do not favor the digital archiving of intangible heritage and orality. And so we were quite gratified. Well, we were gratified to know that what we perceived as a lack in the resources space was in fact also borne out by research being done by independent scholars working in the same fields. And so I took another quote of hers who's quoting some other scholars in her paper, talking about how humanists, and speaking of digital humanities more broadly, have to be aware, have to be aware of what it is that they're making and documenting. And that sort of brings up kind of the not so secret superpower of the Klezmer Archive team, which is comprised of technologists, researchers, academics, librarians, archivists, and user experience specialists, who also, in the very vast majority, also happen to be klezmer music practitioners. And so in this quote space here, I'm adding in that we need to be thinking of culture bearer, which I did not update. We're not using that term so much anymore, but I did not update it. That data generated and retrieved by computer programs must be used and interpreted by a researcher or a heritage practitioner just as critically and rigorously as a historian or musician or community member or ... And so that kind of sums up our approach to what we're doing here with Klezmer Archive. So another important thing to say about the Klezmer Archive before we kind of dive into the talk about how we're documenting. First, we should talk about what it is that we are documenting. Unlike what many people would think about as an archive, our archive is not primarily intended to hold physical objects, right? Ordinarily, an archive would be a place that contains objects, whether they be books or artifacts or other physical resources. Our digital humanities archive will document the existence, like music as a sort of abstract, as an abstract concept that gets expressed in a variety of ways. And it will describe physical objects as they exist and are known to exist, and then will point to links to other archival spaces where those physical objects might or might not be held. Does that make sense to everybody?
Edward asks, music as audio.
What I mean by that is the idea to have access to sound recordings, videos, YouTube, that kind of stuff, or are we talking about sheet music or all the above? Or I might be opening up a lot of stuff.
So the answer to that question is, this is like annoying, but like this gets really to the heart of what we're talking about. Yep. Is that, so the answer is yes. Okay. Yes to all of those things. So we're taking music as the primary artifact, right? And so I have in my head the concept of a tune that we would call Firnde Mechatona Mahain, right? I hold this idea in my head of how that music sounds in a particular performance that's sort of recorded in my brain. And you might also have that same piece of musical concept recorded in your brain that you know from listening to recordings. Likewise, Dr. Zev Feldman also has that concept in his head. So now we're taking the idea is to like take that thing, it's a concept, and we're going to be finding ways to document that concept as it is expressed, for example, on a gramophone recording of Naftuli Brandwein recorded a performance of himself playing that tune, that melody, in 1928 for X number records, right? So we have that is a manifestation of that concept of that tune. And then it's also then reproduced in a book. The complete Klezmer has an expression or a manifestation of that concept. So we don't need to hold one gramophone recording and on one book and one CD with the reproduction of the gramophone side. We don't need to actually hold those physical objects to know that they were created and that they exist. Does that a little bit answer your question?
I think so, Christina. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
So the question then is, that leads us really to the question, and the question that we're trying to identify and answer in this presentation, which is, well, how do you document all of that stuff, right? How do you document it in a way that sort of goes beyond the bibliographic or the discographic library cataloging things? Like, how do we link library cataloging systems and those kinds of descriptions together with the sort of bigger questions about how that melody, that concept of a tune, fits into music of oral tradition, and that has descriptors that make it useful for people who want to actually perform and understand from a musicological perspective, from a cultural perspective, from a historical perspective, but also from a performance perspective. And so that really is the very question at the heart of Klezmer Archive project, right? How do we archive and document this big thing? And so we came up with a kind of a framework of groupings for metadata that will surround a particular item, a musical item. And so group one, traditional catalog and bibliographic discographic information, that's your mark. That's your Dewey Decimal, which, or any kind of format that you might think about. It could also include DAX archival descriptors, if that's relevant. If you have a manuscript that is physically held in a space and it has like a DAX framework description, that also would kind of go into this group one that we've envisioned, because that is how libraries and archives and WorldCat and that great digital resources of the world, they all communicate to each other through that medium, right? So we need to make sure that that's clearly there. But what we know is that for a musician such as myself, that traditional catalog information does not always give me relevant information about about a lot of things. What is the dance genre? What is the social function? What is, where does this fit into this sort of larger cultural space? And so there we go with group two, what we identify as group two, which is corpus specific metadata and tune specific sort of ways of adding analysis, right? So an example of corpus specific metadata are ways that maybe Klezmorim think of to describe tunes and categorize tunes that would be opaque or not useful to outsiders, like an idea such as skoczna, or even basic terms such as kale besetzen, which is the seating of the bride, or freilachs, or volach, or all of these sort of words and concepts that make sense inside the culture, but would be opaque outside of our cultural sort of space, and which apply to the music within this space in a way that they wouldn't necessarily apply to music outside of this space. Now, tune-specific musical formulas that could include things such as modalities. It could include modulation. It could include references to tonal centers and the movement of tonal centers and modulations across a tune, and that are they could also refer to, let's say, cadential formula. They could refer to like any number of things that might have to do with musicology, the description of the music in qua music, right? And that once again are maybe mostly relevant to understanding this music in its musical, cultural, and performative space. For example, many many authors use Western musical notation to write down, as they would, in key signatures to write out klezmer tunes that are actually what we would identify as being in a mode. So this tune specific musical formulas is a way to say, like, well, that tune has this key signature that would say that it's in G, but in fact, it's actually a klezmer would think of it as being in a different key, in a different mode, right, with a different tonal center. Relationship or semantic metadata is a way of linking melodies to each other and people to melodies, and these are the relationship data. And then group 4 would be commentary and discussion, and that is the way for experts to add additive information about a particular item, a musical item. And it's a space for members of the community to share their commentary. It's a place for agreement, and it's a space for disagreement, in a respectful way, and for, just basically like additive information that comes in from members of the community. So these images might be quite familiar to a Jewish audience. There is obviously a model for this, right, in Jewish culture, that you take your primary item, you take your primary text, you have location information and reference information around the sides, and then you have a space for commentary that is weighted for specific commenters. Certain commenters have more weights than others, but there is a space for different interpretation of various items, right? And that disagreement is not does not need to be collapsed into a single narrative, but that disagreement is deeply productive and intellectually stimulating and quite necessary, in my mind, to create a living a record, a living conversation about our specific topic. So now we get to this, because we refer to this as sort of a Talmudic approach, a Talmudic display, and lo and behold, we found that this this concept has been, this is part of the digital humanities approach as well, because we now have tools, these digital tools. Computational power allows us to create these things. And so the HONEY, the Humanities Networked Information Project in Australia, says in its About section, it's been designed to support the underlying precepts of humanities research, especially complexity, contestation, and connection. Multiple interpretations of relationships, including conflicting ones, can be represented. Connections do not have to be right, quote, or quote, authoritative, or even logical. But goes on to say, user-generated links can be as creative and complex and nuanced and contrary as the multitude of HONEY users themselves. And we found this to be a very powerful validation of the concepts that we had already had about how to think about this tool. Because contestation is like what you get on any bandstand, or any any Jewish bands and any bunch of Jewish musicians getting together are going to be in dialogue about the music that they're playing, and that's actually great. That's what makes this musical culture, or any oral musical culture. I'm not singling out klezmer here, because you see it in Irish music, you see it in Bulgarian music. Name your musical form, you're going to have those same kinds of conversations, and that's what makes living music cultures supports them. And so this is a way of thinking about tools and frameworks that can support these ideas. And so we have, I'm just putting some logos here about that refers to tools and frameworks that we're consulting as we are thinking about our own ontology. What is an ontology? An ontology is a way to describe, it's kind of a formalized way to describe things within your collection. I think, and Max, did I get that right? Max, having not said anything, I'm going to say that probably I'm going to.
Oh, sorry, you can hear me?
It's okay. Did I get that right? I was talking about an ontology as a formalized way to describe items inside of a collection of things.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty close.
It's pretty close, right? It's a scary word. And there are other meanings of ontology as well, but for the purposes of this discussion, this is a way of organizing concepts within a collection, right? And so these are 5 of many things that we've been using. Networker is a tool that we use that allows for a very fast sort of like data input and making connections between things. Doremus is a great project that connected 3 major French music archives together. Honey is the Humanities Network Information that I referred to earlier. The music ontology, you might not be surprised, is a important thing. And now we're more recently been looking at the RDA registry. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what those are, but just for those who know, those are kind of some of our main sources. So all of that is prefaced to where we are now, which is the thing that kind of got this off to a start was the idea that we wanted to document a Facebook thread, right? It's a very silly sort of a project, but actually has sort of deep implications for what it is that we're talking about. So I conducted a networker experiment to capture one of those big wide-ranging threads that we all know about, right? And this was a thread that was about what I'm going to refer to as modular tunes. These are tunes comprised of parts of other tunes. And this was like this was a classic Klezmer version of this type. And you see there's lots of videos, all kinds of references, and there's conversations. And so we wanted to use this experiment to sort of try to hang these ideas from Doremus and Honey onto this complex set of relationships. And so just some basic statistics, we have 43 comments. There were a lot more comments, but the 43 were top comments. 13 different people who talked about 78 cassettes, reels to reels, CDs, YouTubes, tune books, operetta and works, and symphonic works. And then there's this huge list of tunes that were referred to during the conversation. So like, kind of a takeaway is like in this Facebook thread, there's this tremendous amount of knowledge that is carried by the folks who were there. What about this? What about that? What about, and Facebook is not for us, right? It's very hard to search. It's like almost impossible to search. Once something's gone, it's sort of gone. And so like, but there's all of this great knowledge that's put there and shared. And so, this is one of those things, like as Elia says here, I wish there was a way to summarize, organize all of the posts and comments there, right? That's classic, it's a classic need, right? And so, we don't think that Klezmer Archive can solve this problem like for once and for all, but we think that we'd like to think that we could get us down the road a little bit. So just to show you, like, so this is like the blown out view of kind of my like doing this work. Doesn't make any sense from here because we're just zoomed out at 50,000 feet. But those are, you see all those arrows between items, like those are the connections, right? Oh, that was just a thread. Now this was our whole graph, like, and this is sort of Claire's work and my work and some other kinds of work. So, it gets pretty messy pretty fast. But here's, this is kind of a overview document of the threads and the main threads that I ended up sort of documenting, I split the main thread into segments and then sort of followed them down, right? You know, just as a way of showing that this is many comments and sub-comments around a variety of topics. And then I made another thread showing the musical items that were talked about on the thread. And all of this was, so Chasam Sanem was the original sort of musical piece that was referred to. And then the whole rest of this thread is all about identifying variants of Chasam Sanem and the items that contributed parts to that rendition. And then there were other branches that talked about other tunes that sort of displayed similar characteristics. And so this is kind of just an overview of those tunes. And then this here, this one now shows that like how we got to where we got to. So the items in sort of peach color that are next to the thread are like this concept of the item. But if we look at the Crimean sketches, we can see that, you know, in yellow, it's a symphonic work that was performed, expressed as a performance, that was captured on a CD, that was then uploaded to YouTube, right? So this concept of this thing of the Crimean sketches, you know, has this path that it traces. The operetta, Leb Leb Yi Hor Hor Acha, part 3, also it's an operetta that was expressed as a performance, that was captured on film, that was then uploaded to YouTube. So the question is, you know, how do we sort of put this all together? And here we can see that a modular tune, this is another one of the subtopics that was referred to as the Bugich Frelix, combines from 2 main sources. So if I follow this roll down here, the bottom branch, you know, it's a Hora Moldovinyaska was a traditional tune that was performed and captured as a field recording on the medium of reel-to-reel that was then recorded to a cassette tape as part of a private collection, you know. And then the other piece, Shad the Rebitans, is like available, as a you know, performance 78 RPM disc, Main collection, Shad the Rebitans. And then on the other side, once this modular composition exists, you have you know, many different people who are also then performing this idea, and that express as performances on video or CD, and then ended up on YouTube things, or in a tune book, for example. So it's a lot, you know, it's a lot. And we sort of have ambitions to be able to kind of live in an open world system that is available to document various components of this very, very large picture in a multitude of ways. Max, I'm going to ask you to tell me if I get this wrong. You know, living in an open world system is a little bit harder because you're not setting a boundary around what is in and what is out. And so this open world assumption is a challenge that we're sort of aware of, and I think that we want to embrace because it seems more powerful for what we want to be doing.
Yep.
Did I get that right, Max?
You got most of the way there. I think
Okay, go for it.
The really neat thing about open world systems is that in traditional databases, the only options you have are, is it in the database or is it not in the database? Whereas an open world system lets you model the information. You can say, this statement is true, or you can say this statement is false, or you can say, we don't know. we don't have information about that. And being able to capture both positive and negative statements is kind of the superpower of an open world system.
Cool. So we want to live in an open world. Any other questions or comments or thoughts, like before I move on to the next thing?
It looks like Zev has a
Yeah,
question.
just a
Go
comment.
for it.
Yeah, that this ultimately emerged out of something that Elias and I were doing for Weimar and the Ottoman Klezmer connection. It was particularly rich and productive, and drew many people from many places. And actually, there's a lot to be learned, especially in this case, because of the nature of the item that it began with.
Totally.
Moscovich's version of not very old at the time. This was one of the first opera creations in Turkey by an Armenian composer, and Moscovitch certainly would have been aware of it directly. And then it definitely, as Bugich probably was as well. So it was particularly fortuitous. There are probably some gratuitous additions there that are just on the basis of very distant relations, whereas others probably show some structural connections that are worth pursuing. So this was actually like we lucked out in this case.
Well, and the thing is, like, so this is the the Facebook space, like I described the downside, which is that it's not for us, it's not searchable. You can't capture or transform that conversation in any way, in any meaningful way in Facebook itself.
Mm-hmm.
But what we have is this really incredible conversation that's happening sort of asynchronously by different people who are bringing things in to that conversation and making these connections. And then the community that is there, the various folks who are in that room, in that virtual space, are then saying, oh yes, that reminds me of this. And oh, I see what you're saying there, but that actually is that's not actually as valid of a connection as you might think it might be, because X, Y, and Z. And so that commentary, that's the commentary. That commentary and discussion is precisely what we want to be able to sort of arrange and organize in a way that will, so that our data structure will be able to show, all of these items like that are described on those threads, and sort of show the linkages together, so that if you wanted to pull up this Chasm Senim, like just pull up that item out of the whole database, that you would be able to then see this map of these networks of connections and then evaluate those connections based on the commentary of the various people who are sort of in that space.
Yeah, it has real potential, absolutely.
And there's real potential there, right? And that's a way it's also a way to make visible, and this is also quite important to us, and Daniel, I see you there. It's important to us to also make the conversations that might happen on a bandstand or in a private space, those conversations still go on, but like it's an opportunity for conversations that happen between experts to happen in a public space as well, which is another benefit of the Facebook space, is that you can be a fly on the wall in that conversation and have the benefit of hearing from those experts in that space. The problem is that once it's gone from the top of the feed, it's sort of gone, it's out of view. But yeah, Daniel.
Hello guys. I was kind of saving this for later, but it's quite close to what you're talking about now, so I may as well. So I was curious about this from the start, so any people are adding connections between these items in your concept map or whatever you call it, and then how do you make so that it's not too full of noise, and how does it become like evolving over time? Because let's say, as you've seen in those Facebook threads, people will say this is definitely the same type of thing, and somebody else says no, it's completely not the same, like you just said. So then you have all these items in your tree here. Somebody will create a connection, but is there any way for somebody to discredit the connection or not discredit, but like put an asterisk or to disagree, you know, all these other things. It's like, how do you map like a negative like movement against these connections? That's kind of what I was wondering.
Yeah, I'm gonna skip ahead to a like a later slide just to sort of show you like, and Max, like, I want you to feel free to chime in because you actually know the specifics of this more than I do.
Yeah, I'll wait for your slide.
What's that?
I'll wait for your slide, but as soon as Daniel said that, I was saying, good question to myself.
Totally. Well, so I'm working on the concepts, like, and Max, I'm on the slide right now. I'm working on the sort of conceptual level, trying to like pull apart this thread. And so here we have Chasm Senum in the center. And then if we follow these areas, you know, I could say that, oh, it does not share parts with Uskudar. And I apologize if you don't know what these tunes are. Like, some of us know what these tunes are, some of us don't, but like, you can see conceptually what's going on here. That, you know, that Turk in America shares parts with Chasm Senum. And according to this, the universe of this discussion, it also shares, and Uskudar shares parts with Turk in America, but Uskudar and Chasm Senum do not share parts with each other, right? There was a supposition made that Chasm Senum is a variant of Porque Lorax Blancanino, which is a Sephardic idea, you know, and then, you know, and so around here. And I'm just documenting the universe of this conversation. But Daniel, to the point that you're making, you know, there's big question marks about whether or not there is a shared part between the Lebdebi Horhor Acha or not, right? And so that is a question. So then, and then down here, they have the Bugic Frelich, you know, we have a similar little circle, and then we have another sort of side discussion that happened up here. So Max, if you'd like to take a stab at this, you can, but I think
Sure.
that, you know, the idea of the open world thing and being able to put commentary on, we call it edges of edges, you know, and to be able to describe certainty and contestation, that is something that the data structure tools that we're working with will, I'm hopeful, allow us to do. So Max, do you want to take a stab at
Sure.
this?
Yeah. So I think there's two, let me turn on my video so you can see my face. Here we go. So I think there's two sort of aspects to the question I'm hearing. One is, how do you make sure that there's not like bogus data? And for that, we're taking the approach of having, like, this database isn't like everything for everyone, it's curated, right? There's gonna be people who review submissions before they're included in the core database. So if you say, Beregowski was born in 1956, somebody's gonna say like, no, actually we have a lot of evidence that they weren't, and no thanks, have a nice day. So it's not a free-for-all. That's the first part. The second is when there are legitimate disagreements between experts. You know, right now this diagram shows like a single arrow that says shares parts with, right? And then, but that arrow actually has a bunch more information attached to it that says who said that, when did they say it, what evidence supports that assertion. That last one's really important because, you know, we're dealing with history. We're not dealing with mathematical facts, and a lot of times there are legitimate disagreements. There's information that's legitimately like unknowable, or with current information unknowable. And the approach that we're taking right now is this is like a new approach that no one's ever done in a knowledge graph before, is, except for maybe is we're accepting all the information. If two people disagree with each other, people disagree with themselves, we will accept that information. We'll just say who said it, and we'll capture what the evidence for that assertion is. And then when somebody asks this thing a question, we give them all of the potential answers to that question, and we'll give them the context to be able to discern the differences between those answers. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks, Max. So I'm hiding these. So let me get back on here. So why can I not go up? Okay, so do we want to skip ahead? Actually, we could probably skip this part. Clara, I don't want to short circuit your thing. So there's a whole thing in here about works and expressions and Dormouse triads and stuff like that. But I think that from the trail and the Facebook thread that you guys probably will get it. And what I'll just say, this is a diagram from the Dormouse tutorial things. And the takeaway that I'm going to just say here is that there's some technical ways that we describe that have been developed, like not by us, but this is a growing sort of field that allows us to sort of create these, we call them triad. We sort of informally refer them to triads, and they can be different, and it's more complicated than this. But basically, the idea is that the work. If we look at this, where's my cursor? Oops. If we look at this thing here, we have the concept of a piece of music. So this is describing a planning of a concert program, and you're like, how do you even document that? And basically, like the Ferber Dormouse ontology that's about music, they figured it out basically, and they use these triads. And the work is an abstract concept that identifies the thing that you're talking about. The event is the time and place that thing happened, where that was created. And then you have these things of expressions. We have expressions and manifestations. They're the same, they're slightly different. But basically what you're seeing is what we're working from is this idea that you can robustly describe like basically every step along the way. And that means like the original performance of, so let's go back to our friend Naftali Brandfeining recording Fearne Mechatonim Haim. We can document, that we know that he recorded, that it was recorded on this date, in this studio, on this label. That's the event. And then we have an expression of it, or a manifestation of that, that's pressed on to a 78 gramophone record. And that can also be described with these sort of recursive triads. And so on down the line. And so then if that 78 performance is now republished on a CD, we can describe that. And if that same performance ends up being transcribed and put into a tune folio, like the complete Klezmer, we can describe that sort of using a variety of these sort of ideas and concepts. So I'm going to just skip ahead. And anybody who wants these slides can have them later. So I was doing that, building the triads, and then we go into our modular tune concepts. And so I'm just going to skip ahead, and I'm going to turn over to Clara. And thank you. Oh my God, I've been talking for an hour.
It's okay. It's so good. I've heard this presentation before and obviously been deep in the weeds of working on it. And it's still like every time it's exciting. So, yay. So Christina's been doing a lot of work with the tune concept and documenting the manifestations, as you just heard. I am in the weeds with how do we deal with humans, because humans are messy, very messy for many reasons. And so I, as many of you know, have been digitizing the field recording collection of Michael Alpert. And so I'm particularly interested in seeing his work and life mapped out in a way that comes closer to representing it and the tunes and the folklore that is transmitted through his network of humans. And he's a perfect example of oral transmission, and it exposes some key places to work on our ontology. And so I'm going to focus in here on his relationship with Bronya Sakina. And we'll get into the weeds on why it's messy really quick here. So first of all, people go by many different names sometimes over the course of a lifetime, and they're spelled differently depending on where you're living, transliterations, all of these things. So from the start, we have humans with different spellings, tracking people, people move, people talk to other people, all of these things. So this is like, you're looking here at a set of traditional metadata for Bronya, which is already fairly messy. And so, but that's not where we're going to focus right now. So if you want to go on to the next screen, that would be grand. So yeah, so a lot of those problems are solved already. Spellings in multiple languages, changing borders of nations, unknown death dates and birth dates. But for today, the more interesting part of the conversation is about her songs, recording instances, and the transmission of those tunes. And so right now we are looking at a fieldwork event in the Elpert collection. Track Elpert 005 is the digitized version of a cassette tape. And so here we have the event, the gathering that was recorded. The work or concept is labeled Elpert 005. And we have self-contained expressions also. Actually, that's not shown here. We can go ahead to the next slide. Yes, self-contained expressions is what I've started for now calling segments of these longer recordings, because it's not like it's a track on an album. It's a 45-minute cassette, side of a cassette that you want time marker 1755 or whatever. So we have self-contained expressions within larger expressions as well. So acknowledging that this event is different from a commercial recording session on many levels, the amount of planning, preparation, recording quality, and venue, to name a few, we're probably going to choose different terms to connect a lot of these things. So on here, you'll see for now, we've used field recording conversant. Then there's participants, and in this example, there's also a translator. All of those labels are going to be refined and ultimately will probably have some amount of flexibility. We can go ahead, actually, wait. Yeah, we can go ahead. Then there's variants of the songs. Here's one, as I recall, that appears multiple times in Michael's collection. So on Elpert 004, we have Ich gehe Royce in Gasse rein. And on 005, we have Ich gehe Royce in Gessele. And in personal communications, Michael has mentioned that the most common version is Ich gehe Royce Eufen Gonnekel. And so this is just an example of the mess of variations. We can go, and very simply, in just a word. Yeah, go ahead.
Right, I want to just go back. I want to ask you a question, Clara,
Okay.
about this one
Okay.
here, this messy one, which
Yeah.
is like, let me see if I get this right in describing the reason that we want to make these segments. In like, why do we want to make it into segments, and what can the sort of segmentation of the conversation plus the linkages out into these various song concepts, like what does it do that we can't do already? And it seems to me that, like, you know, if we're thinking about the Wexler Oral History Project, like they make transcripts of the conversations, and they might do some segmentation, and keywords can be pulled out of those transcripts. And that's important, but like it seems like the segments are a more powerful way to sort of identify topics of conversations and then link them directly to these song concepts or other conceptual things such as the variants and stuff like that. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately for me, having lived with thousands of field recordings from Michael now, like I want the access to these and the usefulness to be as close to the commercial recordings as possible, right? And so like, because there's so much good information there. But if it's much like with the KMDMP project, if I say, oh, I know there's one conversation in 1,300 tracks about this particular subject you're asking about, like no one who is gonna.
If you can't find it, almost like it doesn't exist.
Right. So we could just say it's on this cassette, but we're going through and detailing the catalog. So why not say, hey, we know it's at 40 minutes in. Yeah, skip ahead and listen to the last 5 minutes instead of the whole thing, because that's where your moment is. So it's just why not have more detail when it's possible, basically. So
and then so this then is like shows the detail that you have three variants of three textual variants of a song, like all being described as closely linked to each other.
Yep. Yeah. And just because it's like, it's a little bit easier for us to say, oh, these three songs have just used a different word. They're obviously a variant. Is a little easier to grab a hold of than these two having variations for this kind of a presentation. So, okay, let's go on now. We're gonna dig into Die Zaposhkalech briefly. So we have, Christina and I over the last year have gone back and forth on tune and song families. And so the way that this is documented right now is a previous version of how I was thinking about song concepts being connected to expressions. Now, we are creating a song or tune family level where the concepts will be connected and each expression will have its own concept. So this is slightly different than what we're exactly thinking about right now, but still you see this web of connections. So basically imagine one more added layer of complexity in between here that is not being shown. So,
but the takeaway is to show that like there are many different performances of the Zapashkalach, but then they all kind of form this cloud of the Zapashkalach, some of which have different text and or whatever, but you can show the lineages between those things. Is that the takeaway?
Yeah, so they're all clearly connected, but we want to be able to still have there's just another layer of these triads in there to add more detail, basically. Here we have an example of one recording in the Alpert collection of Bronya singing Die Zaposhkalech on Alpert 239. Of course, we know the band Brave Old World, which Michael was a founding member of, also recorded the track on their album Beyond the Pale. And in the liner notes, Michael says, quote, I learned this song in Bronya Sakina's kitchen. We can therefore connect the expression Die Zaposhkalech BOW for now to Bronya directly. But what it doesn't demonstrate well is the quality of the relationship that transmitted this tune. So learned from can mean from a recording or a manuscript without a direct connection to the person. And what we really don't get from this is the sense that when Michael says he learned it in Bronya's kitchen, he heard it multiple times on multiple occasions probably and spent countless hours with her in that kitchen. So the question I'm trying to get to here is, how do we represent the quality of a human relationship within this framework? Because I think that's really important. And also, we often talk about the people who are teachers in our communities who maybe don't have a massive recording collection, that if you went to an archive or a library, you're not going to find them, but their influence as much, but their influence is incredibly important for the spread of tunes and culture in our community. And so what I've been working on is a relationship concept. I think we can Go to the next slide. Yeah, which this is all changing again too. But in this instance, I've initially called this a mentorship concept for Michael and Bronya. However, while we were working on the catalog, I don't know, a week or two ago, I finally asked him, like, how would you describe your relationship with Bronya? And his immediate response was, well, she's like an aunt. And then I was like, okay, what else? Use more words. And he said, well, a collaborator. And I was like, well, that's very different. Like, I would use collaborator to describe you and Alan Byrne, for example, in a band together. But that's not the same relationship as you and Bronya. And he's like, right. And so we've kind of got into the weeds, but he did say specifically he didn't experience that relationship as a mentor-mentee relationship, even though even myself, having worked in the collection, might assign that relationship description. So from that conversation with Michael now, we can go ahead to the next slide. This is the more zoomed out version of their relationship in the networker. So from that conversation, we are talking about, like we have Toon families, potentially having cultural families, or I don't know what we're going to call that term exactly, but a much broader overarching, almost above the concept level, to connect the humans and have more description there to describe it. So we have clear lineages, like familial lineages within this community that aren't actually biological families. And so tracking that helps to track the passage of cultural information. And so I haven't put this into the networker yet. But you get a sense here of the complexity of this very quickly. And so we're still working out how to make the quality of those relationships more evident and useful for search and whatnot as well. Christina, you look like you've got stuff to add.
Yeah, well, I wanted to, since it's my screen, like here. So the networker is this incredible tool that we can't talk about how awesome it is, but it's a really, really cool tool. And it was super helpful for us to be able to work with it. So it's great at being able to make these connections. What it's not great at is like lifting up certain kinds of relationships. And that's what the RDA and these other kinds of tools that we're using will allow us to do. That I could say, okay, here's a big pile of data. I want to just lift up the human relationship map, and I want to see human to human like a network, right? And we can't do it in networker, but we can do it probably. The idea is we can do it with different kinds of tools. But even here, you can see if I show it here, we've got Bronya here, we've got Michael Alpert here, and then over here is Alan Byrne, and there's Kurt, right? And there's Kurt Bjorling. So even in this sort of small-ish representation, if we were just to lift up the people, we would see this close and tight relationships between Meish and Alan Byrne and Kurt Bjorling, and then Bronya as being also tightly associated with Michael Alpert. And like ideally then, as we kind of map out this stuff, we'll see a little bit more of the mapping of human relationships. If we talk about Deborah Strauss, for example, as being this like incredibly profound, having this just wide-ranging reach as a teacher of klezmer violin over many, many decades, and if you only looked at her recording catalog, you might not understand what a influential person she has been in the transmission of this. And there's many, 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 many people who in our community who have these same qualities. And so this is a way to sort of make sure that we're mapping those relationships out, and hopefully not in an invasive way. Like we're not trying to like, I don't know, like I know that there's like mapping human relationships, like it's a double-edged sword, but like we want to be conscious of doing these things in ways that are helpful and useful and not harmful. But that's a conversation we're having. So back to you, Clara.
Yeah. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, this gets more into, this is tracking the transmission of Dieselbuschlach again, if you want to go to the next slide. So we have, this tune, or this quote is kind of the heart of what's driving this relationship concept idea. Bronya said, a song is the past, present, and future because all that is life is in these songs. Right now, my songs are the present, but they are the future as well, your future. Your children will also sing these songs, and you'll tell them that once there was an Aunt Bronya, and she sang songs like this. So if we can document we can document the tunes and the transmission of the tunes, but ultimately it's human to human transmission. And so getting to the heart of that should be illuminating. I think that's kind of where this is more where of the, we can pass back to you. This is really just showing again the expanse in transmission of this one tune, because it's one of Bronya's most well-traveled tunes and recorded. So,
Great.
So there are things that came in the chat while I was
Well, we were chatting. Anyway,
yeah.
hello everybody, and thank you for staying for that. So let's look at the chat. And does anybody have questions, thoughts, responses, all of that stuff?
Yeah, Edward said more detail is more useful for researchers, which is exactly true. One of the things that continues to be so obvious to me about the state of klezmer research, and for new people in particular, is that it often feels like you got to start from scratch, because there are plenty of resources out there, but they're scattered, and you don't know where to start when you're brand new. And having this archive as a central spot to get you headed in certain directions, I know if it existed when I first started in this world, I would have been so thrilled. So yeah.
Edward, do you want to talk a little bit more about the comment that you made here about establishing primary sources is a challenge?
Yeah, I think part of that is that, part of the challenge, I think, of such a broad and admirable project like this is, how do you even find the people that are the scholars or the experienced people to be able to ascertain what in fact are the primary sources that we have, we need to establish this, to establish this whole, project. I guess that's one thing. I mean, it's raising a lot of questions in my own mind. It's so admirable. It's so broad. It's so broad ranging, but it's also kind of like daunting, I guess. About what's been done and what needs to be done still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess one of the things I'm hearing in your question is like the data. where does it come from, and who puts it in there, essentially? And we're using the KMDMP collection as our case study. And that is, manuscript primary sources, and then we're adding metadata. But one of the things in the next phase here is really about data ingestion and making systems that work are accurate, have all of the quality needs met. And so that's one thing.
Yeah.
And
I come from a background, like, I've worked in a number of libraries. I've worked at Brandeis University, at Harvard, and Library of Congress. Too many to mention. But mostly working in projects similar to this, but using that had already been well-established resources. Thesauri, like the Library of Congress subject headings, these kinds of things, certain catalogs where there was already in place a set of standards that made it a little bit easier to try to pull all the kinds of things that you're trying to do together.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking directly to that, our colleague and friend who you may actually know, Judith Pinolis, has been doing some work specifically with the Library of Congress, like subject headings. And she relayed to me in a private conversation, in an interview, that, you know, there was like, in the Library of Congress subject headings, I think there's one for Jewish dance,
Yes.
and that's it. Right. And that's it. And there was nothing beyond there. And so she was finding herself, you know, you know, we need to be in dialogue, obviously, with Library
Yes.
of Congress, obviously, right? It sort of
Mhm.
goes without saying.
Mhm.
But what we experience is that there is such a paucity of domain specific descriptive metadata that we have an opportunity to add to these resources by building out our own things. And I know that Judith has added some of that, but like basic dance concepts like Freilachs and share and other things like we would be hopeful that we can eventually be sort of recognized and added to various spaces.
Certainly.
Does that, I see you saying like, I'm not so sure about that, but do you want
No,
to?
no, 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 no. It's exciting. First of all, I haven't been at the Library of Congress since 1995, so
Uh-huh,
that's been, you know, almost 27, 28 years. So I don't know Judith at all. But
uh-huh.
again, you know, one of the things about this project that seems so exciting is that, you know, this is an opportunity to help maybe create your own standards, as it were, but involving people, you know, other peoples that have done these things before, to get some kind of guidance to be able to establish these kinds of standards.
Totally. Daniel, do you want to speak about what you just wrote in the comments?
Yeah, I was saying it reminds me of this Brian Deere classification system, which is kind of an indigenous, I think maybe American or maybe like, yeah, I think American classification system, because when you would have like a collection or a library that is like, you know, an American Indian or indigenous Canadian library, if they're using Dewey Decimal or the different systems, it's like everything would be within this tiny digit of this numbers assigned by some librarian years ago, you know. So then they came up with their own whole system, and there's other variants on it from New Zealand and different places, and they take in not only putting more detail into different areas and more insider knowledge, but also sometimes they restrict who owns a certain thing, who actually is allowed access to certain cultural concepts, which is not so much in this klezmer music stuff, but there may be some parts that are actually restricted to the public and are only for insiders. So they may be held by the archive, but they're not actually open. They're like a restricted part, and that's part of it, I think. Yeah.
That's so
Hmm.
cool.
If I could speak to that, um, two of the classification and cataloging classification systems that I've worked with, amongst others, are the Dewey Decimal and the Library of Congress. So one of the things that has to be established is what kind of a cataloging system do you want to have for this particular project? Because each of these cataloging systems serve different audiences, but also certain variance in terms of how broad or how specific they are. But not only that, but it also speaks to the issue of, Daniel, what you're suggesting, which is then things get into the interpretation of the individual cataloger. And I don't think, for the purposes of this, we should even get involved with these kinds of things, because that's a whole nother, you know, that's a whole nother can of worms.
So I did want to mention that as we were writing the next phase grant, a huge part of our work, particularly in preparing for that grant, because the NEH wants to know that they're supporting something that can be used by many people, conceptually or technically or whatever. So one of the things that we dug very deep into is interoperability. And so we've started, we have spreadsheets going where we have each of the categories in the Library of Congress system listed out, and then we're cross-referencing with CDOC and Doremus and all of them. We're trying to basically, we know what we want to add on top of that, but we're going to try to figure out the best way to combine and represent as many of those within the space as well, that like it can't be all of it. I mean, in the same
Give them
way
choices.
that it's articulated in all of those spaces, but there will be we're cross-referencing. We want to be able to connect. It's very important that we can connect.
Mhm.
I would also add that when we're talking about publications, like, so we're talking, so like kind of top level, we're like, we're talking about sort of documenting the concepts of a musical idea, right? Like the expressions of that, many of the expressions of that musical idea will already have bibliographic, discographic, or, you know, other like catalog information that's already ascribable to it, right? You know, the CD, Brave Old World, Beyond the Pale, you know, it has an ISBN, it has, you know, it has all of those things that sort of fit into very standard classification system, so that when you go to the library, you can pull it off the shelf, you know. And so we're not intending to necessarily hold those, although we're going to be referring to those bibliographic, discographical citations, right? All like that information is sort of there as a baseline. In the RDF space, so that's where we're like the Ferber, CDOC, I'm going to just say a string of words with like, you know, acronyms. The music ontology, like, is a kind of a standard that we can use to make sure that our classification ideas sort of align with terminology that's in the music ontology, and that if there's something that we can use or reuse, that we can use within the definitions ascribed within the music ontology, then yes, like there's no reason to, you know, there literally is no reason to try to go beyond it. Now, if there's a concept that is not represented well in the music ontology, then we can do the work to define the concept and then propose that concept to the music ontology or to other spaces. And the other one that we've been working with that I need to explore more is the RDA space. And I can't remember what RDA stands for, but RDA is like, it's a big, powerful graph descriptive thing, resource description and access. The RDA registry is it's kind of based in the RDF space, RDF triple store, like that space as a descriptor, and it's similar to Ferber, CDOC, and those spaces. They're really very deeply related to each other, and I think we're going to be mining that resource also to come up with usable and reusable descriptors that describe the kinds of things that we want to describe. Like, how do you describe a band? How do you describe membership in a band across time, right? Like, there's ways that we don't have to invent the wheel. We don't have to reinvent anything. We can just use what's already there, and we can take those concepts and sort of like meld them into our ontology. And once we kind of have everything that the idea is to map what we can on what exists. And then if we see that there's an idea or concept that we cannot represent using the tools that are available to us, then we can be proposing extensions. So it's about making extensions and adaptations rather than trying to, you know, I mean, this is decades of work and literally hundreds of thousands of hours of very smart people trying to figure these things out. So like, there would be beyond hubris to like think that we would, you know, we don't want to try to reinvent that stuff. But we do think that there's some legitimate space for us to be doing new things. And the other big novelty is the idea of, I think, presentation. That we haven't spoken about this at all. It's about presentation, like censoring the item of music and taking that, if you remember that Talmud page, you know, the text in a Talmud page is there's a central text, and then you put the commentary around it. Now, we're thinking of textual commentary, right? But we could also imagine a space where the central text of the music is central, and there's a way to see a pitch map. There's a way to hear it, That's another way of presenting the text of the music in a way that is, it is being done, but that's still pretty new-ish technology, so that a visitor can say, oh, I heard about this tune, and so you can go to the one display potentially where you could see, have the music in the center, and then like people talking about what is the social function, what is the talking about the performance, but you could also go to another view where you'd see that music in the middle, and then you would be able to listen to like a MIDI playback. You could see a Verovio rendering of the engraving of that tune, and you could listen to, you would have a link to listen to the Mayrent collection that has the audio file of that melody available to you. So kind of putting all of these things that already exist into one place, putting the tools together, that's kind of a novelty for us as well. Go ahead, Clara.
Yeah, I was gonna make sure that we got to presentation also, because what we've been talking about, the part of the point of this session is to give you the behind the scenes, under the hood, like all of the stuff we're thinking about for structure. But what we've just talked about is a mountains of data, right? And so we're not going to present all of that all of the time to all of the users. That would be not useful. And we want the tool to be useful. And so we are also looking at ways of presenting data. Like we have this concept of the Talmudic view, but also serendipitous search is something that we're looking into, and generous interfaces. And we aren't going to get into the weeds of that in the next 3 minutes. But if we build a structure, it's coming up. Yeah. If we can build the data in a way that is standardized, and our tech team can work with it in a way that is easy, hopefully, then presenting it and searching within it also becomes easier. And so this is really the foundation of making all of this mountain of data accessible and useful. And so speaking of it's coming, Christina is going to present, and this will get into the weeds of the presentation stuff a little bit, I think, right? As I recall, on March 12th is the next one of these coffee hours. And Christina will be presenting on archives as network, a summary of 2 presentations that she's given recently. And so the conversation continues.
Thank you. And I would add that we're hoping that we can also invite our tech fellas, tech folks to come in and have another conversation about this, the knowledge engine technology that we are exploring to sort of actualize this ontology, and to do a bunch of really amazing stuff that I am barely qualified to describe, that has to do with validation and reasoning, automated reasoning and stuff like that. Like I said, so that we can be looking forward to those conversations about, kind of coming up through the spring.
Yeah.
So Edward, I think we need to talk. We should probably chat.
Well, this is, as I said at the beginning, this is a wonderful project, and I'd like to get involved in this in some capacity. I do have a little bit of experience, but I don't have the foggiest idea about what you need, and what I could best prevail, and what I can best do, and how much time I'd be committed. So for starters, what I would like to do, maybe get from you, Christina, and Clara, is maybe this actually presentation. It looks like it's kind of like a PowerPoint presentation, I guess. If you can send me that, or if it's at your website, I'd like to look at this, because there are a lot of things that I'm just kind of percolating in my mind in terms of questions that I have, that but also maybe where this goes. And so yes, we need to continue this conversation.
Sure.
I just dropped, we haven't posted on it much recently, but a lot of these concepts are talked about again in our blog, where we're documenting some of this work also. So I just dropped that link in the chat as well.
Okay.
And one of the things that we'll hopefully get the next round of funding also, and then we will be having sessions with working groups where basically we can present some ideas and concepts and you can poke holes in it. Like we want, before we get into implementing any of it, we need to break it a bunch of times and fix it again. And so that is a critical spot where folks like you with experience can be incredibly useful also. So.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'd just like to say thank you so much to everybody who's stayed and who joined us today. If you have follow-up questions, you can always please, by all means, write us at info@klezmerinstitute.org or to me or Clara individually, Clara at Klezmer Institute, myself, Christina at Klezmer Institute, and we'd be really delighted to share. I'm happy to share the PowerPoint and to.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Nice seeing you all. Nice meeting you all.